The most recent release of over 3 million pages related to the Jeffrey Epstein case have revealed just how deeply intertwined in science Epstein was. But they also reveal how the world that he existed in exerts its influence over the scientific, economic, and political communities today. This most recent release should have us asking a lot of questions. Why was Epstein so interested in science? Why did some of these scientists approach Epstein even after he'd been convicted? Is this a systematic issue? And if so, how did the system of science become what it is today? How did Epstein and those before him co-opt science? This recent article published in Nature not only highlights some top scientists that were involved with Epstein, but demonstrates just how much he was influencing them. Examples that allude to deeper ties that Epstein had to the man who bent the world of science to the will of the scientific publishers beginning in the 1950s. The article lists major scientists that were intertwined with Epstein. Among them, theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss received at least $2,500 on the record from Epstein. Another theoretical physicist, Lisa Randall, kept in close contact with Epstein and exchanged humorous emails with him even after he was convicted. Martin Nowak, a mathematical biologist, was given $6.5 million in 2003 by Epstein, an exchange that we'll cover later in this video. And real quick, before we get into it, this episode is opinion meant for entertainment purposes. The articles used are cited in the description below. I highly recommend checking them out. Please give this video a like, share it with a friend, and leave a comment below to let me know what you think about this unfolding story. The examples in the article show us the reality of scientists' desperate need for funding in a system where the publisher has the power to make or break a scientist's career. The truth is that this precedes Epstein and involves a similar character who was also knee-deep in the intelligence community, from MI6 to the KGB to Mossad, according to Pulitzer Prize winner Seymour Hersh's 1990s book, The Samson Option. A man who loved to throw lavish parties at scientific conferences to lure in scientists with promises of prestige, funding, and publication. A man whose 1991 death effectively left a vacuum to be filled by Epstein. Robert Maxwell. One of the most revolutionary figures of the 20th century who single-handedly made science and academic institutions subject to the will of private publishing companies. But it's likely that this is your first time hearing about him.
We don't really understand Robert Maxwell.
Sorry, who's Robert Maxwell?
So who was he? The most obvious and relevant connection is that he was the father of Epstein's ex-girlfriend, confidant, and partner in sex trafficking, Ghislaine Maxwell. And just like Epstein, Maxwell was interested in science. So much so that back in the 1950s, he and a metallurgist and fellow ex-British intelligence member, Paul Rosbaud, bought a small scientific publishing company that they named Pergamon. Pergamon is the reason why scientists are starving for funding today. It's the reason why high-profile plagiarism and falsified data cases plague major institutions like Harvard and Stanford. It's the reason why there is a reproducibility crisis in science, and the reason why the scientific industry operates under one simple rule: publish or perish. Maxwell is the root of these critical issues. He took scientific publication out of the hands of scientific societies and put it into the hands of private publishing companies, ultimately resulting in a triple pay system in which the government, our tax dollars, funds most research, pays the salaries of those editing and peer reviewing the research, then pays to purchase the journals for their institutions. Maxwell made a profit machine that also gatekeeps the scientific process. The process itself would eventually funnel scientists desperate for funding to donors like Epstein. Donors who have goals and interests of their own that, let's just say, probably are not for the greater good. An example of this is Epstein's fixation on eugenics, an outdated branch of science that attempts to use genetics to explain quote-unquote racial superiority, particularly genetic determinism, which is, quote, still fashionable in some wealthy circles and can be seen in companies offering designer baby services, unquote. Now, back to Maxwell and Rosbaud. How did they come to dominate the world of scientific publishing? Previously in history, scientific publishing was handled by scientific societies. Maxwell and Rosbaud recognized that these scientific societies were in no rush to publish papers and were often, quote, hampered with internal debates, unquote. They recognized an opportunity to co-opt the publication process, and inevitably the whole scientific process in general, at the expense of the scientists, government programs, and us, the taxpayers. Their formula was simple: convince top scientists that their specific field of study needed its own journal, make one of the top scientists in that respective field the representative of the journal for their field, and then sell the crap out of subscriptions to every university, library, and institution they could. Maxwell's parasitic thirst for profit, market dominance, and power over the scientific world made Rosbaud leave the company in disgust early on in 1956. But that had no effect in slowing him down. He threw lavish parties at his estate in Oxford and near science conferences where he would give away incentives to publish with Pergamon, like Concorde jet flights or chartered boat tours of Greek islands. Leslie Iverson, former editor of the Journal of Neurochemistry, commented on a party at Maxwell's estate. Quote, "He was very impressive, this big entrepreneur. We would get dinner and fine wine, and at the end he would present us with a check. A few £1,000s for the society. It was more money than us poor scientists had ever seen." Unquote. This account of Maxwell's tactic to draw scientists in is pretty much the same as the methods Epstein would use to lure scientists to his parties, island, or ranch. Like when mathematical biologist Martin Nowak visited Epstein's island. Nowak describes how he was cold called by Epstein while he was a researcher at Princeton. He went to Epstein's island, and on the last day of his visit, Epstein said that he would build an institute for him. After Nowak moved to Harvard in 2003, Epstein provided him with a check for $6.5 million, which today would be just shy of $11.5 million, that he used to establish the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics, or PED.
Doesn't look like anything to me.
Distasteful acronyms aside, Maxwell's efforts to boost the prestige of scientific publishing companies was a resounding success that gave them untold power and influence over scientists and the research they were conducting, ultimately giving the publishers so much power they could completely destroy your career. You know, if they really wanted to. Now, if scientists wanted to get published, guess what? They'd have to present experiments that they thought the publishers would approve of. This introduced a quite heavy dose of bias into a practice that's supposed to be as unbiased as possible. Quote, "In the mid-1970s, publishers began to meddle with the practice of science itself, starting down a path that would lock scientists' careers into the publishing system and impose the business's own standards on the direction of science." Unquote. If scientists were now puppets, then Maxwell and editors at his and other scientific journals were the puppet masters. And by this point, and even today, there is no way out of the system. Quote, "The scientific article has essentially become the only way science is systematically represented in the world. If you control access to the scientific literature, it is, to all intents and purposes, like controlling science." Unquote. But Maxwell didn't just control the scientists, he also controlled the subscriptions of every one of the 400 journals in Pergamon's portfolio, and accurately predicted that competition in a market where academic libraries and institutions needed to subscribe to as many journals as possible would not drive the price down, but up. Between 1975 and 1985, the average price of subscribing to a journal doubled. The New York Times reported in 1984 it cost $2,500 to subscribe to the journal Brain Research. And by 1988, it costs more than $5,000. And that's just to subscribe to one journal. Academic and institutional libraries need to subscribe to hundreds of journals to stay up to date with the scientific research. Quote, "Libraries were locked into a series of thousands of tiny monopolies. There were not more than 1 million scientific articles being published every year, and they, the libraries, had to buy all of them at whatever price the publishers wanted." Unquote. This meant that libraries were now a captive market, and, quote, "journals had improbably installed themselves as the gatekeepers of scientific prestige." Unquote. Even as recently as 2009, the bill for scientific subscriptions at Cornell University was almost $2 million, which is over $3 million in 2026 money. Maxwell knew the market all too well, saying that scientists are not as price conscious as other professionals, mainly because they are not spending their own money. It's worth mentioning that there was actually some pushback early on in the stages of this co-opting, and the scientific community was not at all happy about Maxwell basically privatizing the scientific process, but the prestige of being published in a top journal eventually completely overwhelmed any remaining dissenters. The craziest and creepiest thing about this is that Maxwell and Epstein knew the vulnerabilities of the scientists and the system in general and exploited it for, at the very least, profit, and at the very worst, control to run strange experiments that you can and probably should look up for yourself, at least in terms of Epstein. Eventually, Maxwell's true character would show. He ended up embezzling $1.2 billion from his company's pension funds in order to cover outstanding debts shortly before his demise in 1991. That's about $2.8 billion in today's money after inflation. And so we come back to the Nature article. Epstein undoubtedly had an unusual relationship with at least some of the scientists that he funded. For example, he not only frequently visited Nowak at the pet office, but Nowak shared proof pages of a scientific study accepted to Nature in 2010 for Epstein's opinion and review. Mathematician Jesse Cass said, "It's unheard of for someone who's providing funding to be engaged with the actual research on that level." But is it really? In 2016, a dentist, Kristen Kearns, discovered documents in a Harvard library basement that showed the Sugar Research Foundation funded 3 Harvard researchers to publish a paper that blamed saturated fat for heart disease while downplaying the role of sugar in heart disease. Her findings were published in JAMA and showed that, just like Nowak and Epstein, the researchers were sending copies of the report to the Sugar Research Foundation for review before it was published. The question here is, just how common is it that those who fund scientific studies have a say in the final publication? Speculation aside, from all of the information that we covered in this episode, what we can say for certain is that money is at least one of the driving factors for controlling scientific publication. After Maxwell sold Pergamon to one of its main competitors, Helvetier, in 1991, the publisher's CEO had this to say, quote, "You have no idea how profitable these journals are once you stop doing anything. When you're building a journal, you spend time getting good editorial boards, you treat them well, you give them dinners. Then you market the thing, and your salespeople go out there to sell subscriptions, which is slow and tough. And you try to make the journals as good as possible. That's what happened at Pergamon. And then we buy it, and we stop doing all that stuff, and then the cash just pours out, and you wouldn't believe how wonderful it is." To me, the story of Maxwell's grip on scientific journals seems like it could be a coordinated effort to both influence science while funneling scientists toward Epstein. The system Maxwell created effectively contributed to scientists' need for more and more funding, which Epstein later provided to at least 30 top scientists mentioned in the recently released files. But there is hope. Citizen science, N-of-1 studies, and open access are all becoming more popular in recent years, which I will cover in a future episode. If you know any other weird information that's come out about Epstein and his connection to science, let me know in the comments below so we can explore it in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.